Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world. Welcome back to The Caring Economy with me, your host, Toby Usnick, here in season 14. And today I'm really thrilled to have as our guest, LaTanya Mapp. She has recently been appointed president and CEO of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, or RPA. Some of you may remember that we've had her predecessor, Amy, here a few years ago, and it's wonderful to continue that tradition. LaTanya brings over 30 years of experience in nonprofit capacity building and a real passion for social justice to her new role. She's also the author of The Everyday Feminist, and that's something we're going to talk about today, and a strong advocate for investing in women to strengthen democracy. So today we're going to explore LaTanya's purpose-driven life, her vision for RPA, and the valuable lessons that she's learned along the way. Welcome to The Caring Economy, LaTanya Mapp.
Thank you, Toby. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. I've listened to a number of your podcasts, and just interestingly, your last guest, I forget his last name, but the
Father
father.
Whitman.
Yes, that's right. His birthday is the same day as mine. Not same year, but same day. I thought that was brilliant.
That is
Maybe
wonderful.
you're drawn to Sagittarius. Yeah.
Well, I'm actually a Sagittarius, and my husband is too. So
Get
maybe
out of here.
give us like a 3 or 4 minute digest of your life, maybe where you're born, how you found your career path, maybe mentors or bumps along the way.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity. I was just at a talking to a number of young fellows that come from all over the world about sort of the path. Everyone's trying at that age. I mean, you and I were as well, trying to that age between college and the real world, I guess, to figure out where we go. And I'm a planner, so I've always had some idea of where I was going, but I'm also one of those people that sort of watch for doors to open. And I've been thinking about it since I had that conversation about how many doors open that kind of led me in these different directions. My mother and father said when I was 5, I wanted to be a lawyer, and I saw Thurgood Marshall on television, and that was what I wanted to do. I grew up in, the inner city of Philadelphia, in an abusive home. My brother went very early to a juvenile facility, and I remember thinking that I needed to do whatever was possible to make sure that he didn't have to be a part of that system, the criminal justice system. And that was kind of where my head was, throughout school.
Hmm.
I was always a good student, and even past that, I would say I'm still a good student, if that makes sense. But one of the things about being a lawyer and being from the inner city, your exchange with the law really is around criminal justice. I didn't know what other parts of being a lawyer looked like until one of those doors was the Woodrow Wilson program out of Princeton that offered, even though I was at University of Maryland, I applied and received what was an opportunity to study public policy. So
Mhm.
I did the joint degree, public policy and law at the University of Maryland. And it opened up a whole new world of understanding how the law is, not just, courts, but it also is our legislature, and how changing laws and trying to reconstruct systems
Mhm.
was also a good way of trying to get at it. But then I was, up until that point, I was completely, thinking domestic. And what really happened was another door opened. One of my law professors was from South Africa,
Mhm.
and she encouraged me and others to go to South Africa to work with the Legal Resources Center. It was at the time that Nelson Mandela was coming out of prison and apartheid was ending. So it was a very special time. And to get to work for that NGO, which, had done so much and still does so much in that country for legal, it really changed the way I thought about what I wanted to do. I came back and did an internship with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which is sort of a mirror group, of course, here in the US. One that I knew the NAACP, I didn't know the Legal Defense Fund, another door, and, met Elaine Jones and others who were at leadership at the NAACP at that time. And I decided I wanted to go back overseas. So I did the UN volunteer program, which is also attached to Peace Corps. So I
Oh.
was a Peace Corps volunteer in Southern Africa and completely changed my life. And from there, I went into international civil service with the United Nations, served in many countries, a particular note, Ethiopia and Kenya, Pakistan, so places that, I only heard about, and so that became I think where I wanted to go. In Ethiopia, another door opened. I met the head of USAID. He told me about the Foreign Service. And this was the time when Clinton's administration was ending. And really, there had been no hiring in the Foreign Service. So they were taking international civil servants like myself that were Americans and bringing them horizontally into the Foreign Service. And so I didn't have to start at the beginning. And that was perfect. You know, I had a family then, had been evacuated from Lesotho, just starting to understand what it means to be international worker. So the Foreign Service with USAID was perfect until it wasn't. Served in many countries, Mali, Nigeria, Iraq, of course. And then I got to the point where when we were in Egypt, that was my last tour with the U.S. Foreign Service, we were evacuated in the Arab Spring. And family, by that time I'd been married and had 2 kids, really was where I had to start thinking about what does it mean to consider their needs and not to just think about my career. And so many, especially women, get to that point where you have to start changing where you align. But in many ways, the door that opened there was I met Cecile Richards over in Egypt. She was on the Ford Foundation's board. She ran Planned Parenthood, and she told me about their international program. I applied and got that role, and then it moved me into the NGO sector, very much aligned with values and the things that I have been doing. And really running Planned Parenthood Global was the first time when I could use my voice politically, when I can actually, show up in a space in a partisan way. So it was incredible to do that work for 7 years. I moved the office from New York to Nairobi. So that we'd be closer to the work that we were doing. And I would have been there forever if it hadn't been for another door opening, which was a Global Fund for Women. My predecessor at Global Fund for Women was from Kenya, so I got to see her quite a bit, and I knew when she was retiring. And so that door was one that I walked through and did really focused work for women around the world, grassroots women, their organizations, their movements for 5 years and out of San Francisco. And it was amazing to be so laser focused on what I call in my book, the Everyday Feminist. And then, again, another door opened after I wrote the book, which seemed like it was an ode to philanthropy. That's not how it started, but philanthropic leaders continuously called me about what they found valuable about the book. I even got a shout out from Melinda Gates when it came out. So then at that time, when this role came around, it just sounded like something that I would have a larger audience to talk about the things that I thought really mattered and how we can really go faster in philanthropy. And so I think that's how I got here and what I hope
Wow.
to do.
What an awesome trajectory you've had and so many things to follow up on. Just as a side note, my husband and I have for decades been supporting Planned Parenthood in the Hudson Valley where we have a home. And it's been such a joy for us we've hosted the annual gala at our house and we are on the committee every year. And every year I think, we say, this is the year we've got to do it. And the work just becomes more important than ever.
Yes.
Tell me about when you made the decision about your family and then coming back to the States. How did that all work out? I mean, I'm presuming the kids all turned out fine and that you're still, happily married, but you're on this great trajectory and you made a decision that had to be some sort of compromise, I would imagine. Is that a fair statement?
Very fair statement. I'm on husband number 2, so I'm happily married, but not to the same person who really I went around the world with. So it is hard. I think it's hard on it, certainly on a marriage. I think for the kids, what ultimately happened was they just wanted to stay in one place. There are huge benefits that that came from them moving around the world. They, got a great education, speak several languages, so those kind of things, which they couldn't know you could care less in high school, It just seems like every time, every 3-4 years, you got to leave your friends. And so for them, it was just being able to stay in one place. They're doing very well. My son is actually in South Africa, about to start grad school. My daughter started college at the University of Bristol in the UK. So there's certainly third culture kids,
Yeah.
came back to the US, which is what they wanted. And I think at some point then decided that they really did need to sort of branch out, so that it's already ingrained in them. But I would say that, most of the families and women that I knew who did, whether it was development work or diplomatic work, it was always, the give and take. You had to figure out how to do the best you can and make the best decisions. And it's never absolutely right. But you know what, Toby? It's not, even if you don't do that, it's always a juggle. It's always a challenge. I love the name of your podcast, because I think about the care economy. I was just talking to the former mayor of Bogota and the work she did, because one of the things that she realized was that for women who were having to take care of their families, I mean, that's their, so they're married, they've got kids, but they're also taking care of their parents, and they're also taking care of their communities, that if they could just be able to access their services within, and I think it was like a 10-mile or 12-mile, depending on how you translate the kilometers from their home. So like the hospital for their parents had to be there, and the doctor's appointments for the kids, of course, the school, the grocery. If all those things were, within a distance that was manageable for them, they could do it all. And I just was sitting there, it's so good to have like a woman running a city who could think like that, because of course she's experienced it or saw her mother experiencing it. And it did everything that we thought it would. It absolutely raised income for the working mom. It absolutely increased the school statistics for the kids. So, it just makes me think like I may have had it, a little bit challenging, but, many people do, and have to navigate that space for women in their careers.
I'm also marveling, Samantha Power, I suspect at USAID. She had done a beautiful recommendation letter for me when I nominated Darren Walker for an OBE from the Queen, which he got, Darren at Ford. And I was just struck, that old saying, like, if you want to get something done, ask a busy person. Like, she struck me as that kind of person. I have to believe that she followed your lead as well. How long were you there?
I was at USA for 12 years. And so I took early retirement because, again, they took my 8 years at Peace Corps and the UN. It was an amazing time, certainly. And one of the things I did was I was a fellow that worked under Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State at the time. It was actually called the Colin Powell Fellowship, which she named, when she came in. And she took, I guess, about 8 to 10 of us, I'm looking at the picture now, who were serving in various parts of the diplomatic corps. And I was the one from USAID. She told me once when I was with her in her office that she always hires women who have families, who are like super, super busy, because she finds that they do incredible work because they don't have a whole lot of time to waste it. The water cooler,
Yeah.
they're
I think
like
that's
constantly
great.
moving and constantly getting stuff done.
I love
So
that.
I think that's funny. And just to think, and she hires incredible people from what I could tell, because some of them are really still going, that it probably was a really thoughtful way of thinking about how you hire, is that people who are super busy don't have time to waste,
Yeah. Now, I want to follow up on that by asking you, you've worked across different sectors, right? UN, state, private sector. It's hard, but could you give us some sort of general takes on each, like for a young person who's hearing this interview or seeing it, what might they want to consider? Should I go out of school for graduate degree or Peace Corps or State Department or into the private sector? Any sort of words of wisdom there?
Yeah, and this is interesting because I talk about this. I'm a part of the International Career Advancement Program out of the University of Denver. ICAP is a group of outstanding foreign affairs professionals of color. And the whole goal is to increase more of us in the fields. And we come from all sectors. And so, you do 2 weeks in Aspen, and then you're a member of a network that continues to both blossom, grow, and learn from. And it was being there that I really learned how important it was to have foreign affairs professionals in all sectors. So it wasn't enough just to have us in, the State Department or USAID or ag or commerce, or even defense, right? So government, of course, needs that kind of diversity, but so does every other place. And so I found moving from, a multilateral like the UN, where there is a great deal of diversity. And just because of the way that they hire from all over the world, you didn't even have that issue, and you saw the beauty of really having people from different places to think together, to learn together. When I went into the Foreign Service, wasn't like that. At all. In fact, when I served in Nigeria, I used to marvel at, how many people in the Foreign Service, especially at the embassy, did not want to be there, so it was just this interesting, sort of cobbling of some of our challenges here in the US with where you serve and perspectives around your own biases. But that being said, moving from a multilateral to what is a bilateral, it was very different. And I would say that people maybe go the other way usually. So they work for their own governments and then they go into the UN. I didn't follow in that direction. So it was a little startling to see how undiverse the Foreign Service was. But we are certainly working on that. And it has definitely got better because, that's, I won't date myself, but I'm sure that was about 20 or so. Yeah, definitely 20 something years ago. Yeah. So it's getting better. But I always say to people too, when they leave, the Foreign Service, there's different roles you can take because it's a 20-year stint and most people do about that much, right? And if you go into what is natural, you can either go to a multilateral like the UN, or you can go into private sector, or you can go to an NGO. And I'm one of these folks that are always trying to encourage people, especially with that level of experience, to go into an NGO. I found that move to be so liberating. I had already had much of the experience of running offices. In fact, because I was moving so often, I ran maybe about 8-10 offices by the time I got to Planned Parenthood. And that skills transfer was easy, because it's the same kind of leadership skills that you need. But what I got to really, and this is what I was saying at the beginning, at NGOs, you really do allow yourself to be mission driven and really focus on the communities that you serve in a way that was very different from either a multilateral or a bilateral. So I would say for folks who are mission driven, who care about communities, whether it's first out of college or not, or first out of law school or whatever, I would say definitely plan that as a part of your career trajectory to make sure you understand how that feels. It is an amazing opportunity to be able to do something that you love and at the same time really see the help that you're providing to people. Yeah. And then, of course, the private sector being more philanthropy, public foundations, again, the skill sets are transferable. So I think with philanthropy in the private sector, the pace is a little bit different, but it's also this opportunity, not like it used to be, but you do have people who care about communities in these settings. And in fact, with what might look and seem and feel more transactional, you still have like this ability to do a whole lot because you have resources at your disposal. So I ask people not to shy away from the private sector because we need those mission-driven people there as well in order to help drive resources to the places where they're needed.
Yeah, I came up through the private sector and I say to people all the time, it's the deepest bench strength is the pockets and all that. So don't rule out the private sector as a real catalyst. That's right. Change, positive change. The other thing I like about your whole narrative, LaTanya, is that I'm a big booster for service, right? So I think if you have your mind or top of mind at all times, how can I be of service to more than just myself? That's a good directional kind of aid, I find. And clearly you've exemplified that in every role you've had. Ladies and gentlemen, again today on the Caring Economy, we have with us LaTanya Mapp. She's been recently, 6 months ago, appointed as president and CEO of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. I think that, LaTanya, I'd like to ask about your book, but I want to stick with RPA for now. Tell us, for those who don't know it, a little bit about it, and then tell us about your sort of, maybe your first take, but then your vision for where it might go.
Thank you for the opportunity. Joining RPA, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, which is in fact, a service provider to philanthropy. And it started with the family thinking about probably tons of calls they received asking advice because, the Rockefeller family is in its 7th generation. And you think about, the big philanthropist, if not the definition of, you look it up, it's probably got John D. Rockefeller on that,
Yep.
on the page of philanthropy. And with all that we know, about capitalism and, inequities that it can cause, I would say that this sort of values a proposition around how do you support your communities through your own wealth and the wealth that you've created during your lifetime is something that really hasn't gone away. So I think it's about as human as anything else, right? People do want to spend their money. And in the US, of course, we have tax structures and other systems that support that kind of wealth transfer, if that makes sense. So I would say RPA was created because of this advisory part. So it kind of was a conflict to keep it in the family philanthropy. And so they pulled it out. Melissa Berman was my predecessor, and she just retired, but had been for the entire 23 years of the organization at the helm. And what it has done is really provided services to whether it's family, individual, or corporate philanthropy to decide how they want to structure their philanthropy. What it should go to is a big piece of what we do strategically, but also how to set yourselves up. It's not like it used to be where this model of building a Ford Foundation or a Gates Foundation and all of the infrastructure that comes with that is necessary. There are so many different ways to actually do your philanthropy, and RPA is, up on all of them. Even if you want to wind down, spend down, I guess is the big one that, people have been calling for, is to spend your wealth within your lifetime. I got to RPA and just saw we have so many models and examples of how we've done that well with organizations around the world. And so we do this piece, the advisory piece, but the piece that's been growing over the last decade is really around collaboratives. So these are institutional, the big ones that all of us know, the MacArthur's, even in Europe, the SIFs, who come together for one purpose. And climate has really been a good one, but it's about health, it's about education, who have discovered, hopefully through, radical listening, that we can't all create, a program to get things done. We do have to come together, put our resources and our thinking together in order to be successful. And some of these problems are just so intractable that if we don't do that, we will actually fail. And a lot of the resources that we have been spending will not end up where they need to be. And so collaboratives for RPA is something that we strongly encourage in order to accelerate philanthropy. We provide the back end for them. We actually set them up. We hire the people that are necessary to run them, and then we manage how those resources then get out and grant them to the grantee partners. And so that's the second piece. And I would say the third piece of RPA is really around incubating ideas. So before you actually have to go off and start an NGO, you can bring your idea to RPA with some funding, and then we will support the back end of that work. And I think that, to me, it is just something that is so important. I mean, we do it on the private side, right? We do it for private sector. We give them the startup funds. We allow them the opportunity to sort of build their idea for some years before they have to start the actual corporations and organizations. And we need to do the same for NGOs and social enterprises, because sometimes those years, those 2, 3, 4 years, maybe even 5, that you are building out your idea and putting it to what I'll call the beta test, are incredibly important to its success. Not having to worry about, payroll, not having to worry about, paying the light and rent bill is crucial to that success. And that's a piece of what we do. And just finally, Toby, we are what we call in the field, I guess our field, thought leaders. And so we do try to start programs that we see are on the rise for philanthropy and offer them support. So systems strengthening, systems change, those are things that we've been talking about for the last 5 or so years. But then everyone's like, well, how do you do that? And so, then we'll work on them. We also have something called foresights and futures. It's like, how do you look ahead and plan backwards? How do you think, where do we want to be in 30 years? And then how do you kind of plan that backwards so you're doing the right thing right now to set us up for a future? But there's, women leaders in philanthropy is another, what we call thought leadership. How do we bring women leaders together to be able to determine navigation of where we are now into a space in a future that we want? So we have quite a few of these kind of things that we call thought leadership, which are, again, as I started, really in service to philanthropy, but in order to get more, better, bolder money out into the world. There's a lot of work that we have to do in partnership. I believe that we have to create cultures and connections across philanthropy with influencers. They're out there, sort of all of them on their own. How do we bring them together to be able to make a special impact? And geographic communities that people love. We talk about the diaspora, we talk about remittances. How do we come together to do those things? And that's the kind of work that I'd like to see RPA really leading on over the next few years.
Very cool. You've covered a lot of things I want to ask you about in terms of trends. You've given us some great ones there. Sally Krawcheck, who you might know of, banker, has just come out
Yes.
recently with this observation about the wealth transfer. And apparently, I think like 80 or 90% of the wealth of aging couples is pouring over to the women because they're outliving their husbands. And something like 80 or 90% of the advisors to these families switch after the husband dies and the woman takes charge. So I like this area that you're talking about with women in philanthropy, and clearly it's a growing area. After the interview, I'll try and find it for you because I was just really struck by this but it made perfect sense to me. I wanted to ask you about your book. So tell us a little bit about it and where it's going and where it's taken you.
Yeah, so it's a year plus now. I have it here.
The
Just so
Everyday
you can
Feminist.
see,
Yeah.
the Everyday Feminist is the key to sustainable social impact, driving movements we need now more than ever. And I mean, the premise is not unfamiliar. It really is. And the foreword, by the way, is by Cecile Richards. And it is this attempt to, I guess it could be memoirish in some ways, but to talk about the places that I've lived and the women that I've met there and the incredible work that they've done for their communities, while, to be honest, not receiving much support at all. Usually doing this out of their back pocket or with some very small funds from church or, from family members. And I guess what I'm trying to say, but I lift up both some very popular people like Lima Gaboe. I mean, there's, so Tarana Burks, who people know from, Me Too, and try to lay out their stories a little bit, but mostly it's unfamiliar people from different parts of the world. And they, the work that they do, like I talk about a governor's wife in Nigeria who really, thank God, she was there to work through the politics and make sure the communities were actually thriving and their ideas were heard. But I do this because I'm trying to convince people to invest in, what is essentially your neighbor, to invest in the work they do because they're delivering. And we all know them, they're the heads of the PTAs, they're the ones sort of running all of the major outreach when something happens. These are the people who are just showing up for the communities, but we make it very hard on them. Philanthropy has had for a long time, and I hope this is changing, done things like, oh, if you're doing work, you can't use these funds to pay yourself. You can't use these funds to pay rent, or any of sort of the core things. And, most of these women, quite frankly, are not even paying themselves. They're paying their staff, but even that gets restricted. And so we really have to be careful not to damper the very thing that is making social justice thrive and social enterprises thrive in the communities. And this is where the book starts to try to encourage various sectors, including and especially philanthropy, but also government and corporate, to be very thoughtful about how you support these women, how you direct those funds too, because if you super restrict them, then they're not going to be able to pivot. We saw that in COVID. You gotta, I mean, yes, okay, this may be HIV/AIDS money, but now we got a, global pandemic. They got to use that money for that, and how we ask of them things that are incredibly difficult for them to maneuver and still do the amazing work that they do. So I hope it's it's the book is really both to be educational, but also to talk about these women. And I have, some of them I talk about within the context of my story, like when I was in South Africa and I worked with parents, mothers who wanted to stop whipping in the school. And so, whipping as a actual ordained punishment. We've done it here in the US too. But the power of mothers to be able to get that done in that country. And then to also just talk about women who are are moving resources to where they're needed, especially fast under onerous conditions, whether that's conflict made by men or conflict, not just men, but humans, I'll just say.
Sure.
But conflict, conflict is one of the biggest pieces of how women and children, as we know, suffer. And then, of course, now what we see is a lot of trouble from climate disasters and how we can mitigate those and how we adapt once these things happen. So much of the book is really just an ode to these everyday feminists, but also helping folks understand what they really get done and over time, how that changes who we are. And hopefully, makes the world better for our future, but also for our children's future.
So, LaTanya, if someone wants to find the book, is it on Amazon or what's the best place to actually?
Yeah, no, it's Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Hopefully your local bookstore has it now and you can ask. I've been going around. One of the things I did in the first year, the tour was really targeted towards small bookstores around the world, and mostly our country. So I went to cities all over, the Southwest, East, North. And really trying to focus on these smaller bookstores that are keeping their communities. It just seemed to vibe well with the
Message.
book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm the same with
And it
my
was very good. Rooms of like 20, 30 people crammed together. It was very special to be able to talk to these women and what they do. And everyone always tells you the stories about their great mothers and grandmothers and what they did. It's a very special opportunity to share that bond and for people to identify, even if you don't call yourself feminist, because a lot of people didn't, and especially a lot of people from overseas, but people got it very quickly, what I was talking about. Yeah.
And then separate from the book, if someone's interested in learning more about RPA, what's the best way to be in touch with all of you?
So RPA is easy. So we're rockpa.org. And so you can find out a lot from that. And of course, we're on LinkedIn and we're on Insta for those that like to use social media to find out more. But it's probably easiest just to go to the website, www.rockpa.org and find out more about us.
Terrific. And I'm mindful of your time. The last question I always ask folks is pearls of wisdom that they may have gleaned throughout their careers. You've led this incredibly purpose-driven life, and I wonder what your pearls of wisdom might be or mantras that you share with people.
This is something that we kind of shared at the beginning, Toby, is to never stop learning. We're living in a world where information is so readily available that we always are sort of taking the soundbite. And so how do we commit ourselves to keep learning, not just about, an issue area, which is also good, but also about people, the people that you sometimes sit around. And I've said this since I've been at RPA. We've got to do like a canvas. I did 90 days of radical listening where I talked to staff and, the broad sense of the staff, all 600, to try to make sure that I understand where people are coming from, and how important that is. And you'll never get that by reading people's bios. So just, for me, really commit. The older I get, the more I understand how little I really know, both about people and about issues. And so you cannot substitute sitting down and having a conversation to not just hear, but also to feel, where people are coming from. And so that's a part of what I'm committing to. And I hope everyone feels that that's especially important in this day and time, because we've got a lot of differences, but we've also got a lot that's alike. And we're just not going to be able to get to it if we don't talk to each other.
Here, I love that statement. I will also say that there's such adventure that comes with that, right? When you start to engage with others that you might not have previously, the world is just a fascinating place. Thank you for sharing that. Ladies and gentlemen, again, today we've had as our guest on the Caring Economy, LaTanya Mapp. She's the new president, somewhat new, 6 months now, president and CEO of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, and really just a wonderful, powerful force for good. I'm so glad to have had you on. I hope you'll come back in maybe a year's time and tell us the latest on what's happening and trends and whatnot, LaTanya.
Thank you, Toby, and thank you for doing this podcast. I appreciate you.
My pleasure.